All right, folks, we're going to get started here with chapter 26. Here's our first image, and here is our lecture preview. We've got 6 sections. We'll take them one at a time. Here is the first focus question. In the post-World War II era, conservatism seemed marginal in a very liberal environment. Conservatism was seen as outdated and associated with conspiracy theories, anti-Semitism, and preferences for social hierarchy over equality. Liberals believed conservatives were simply alienated or psychologically disturbed. In the 1950s and 1960s, conservatism was reborn. In 1968, a backlash of formerly Democratic voters against black protest and the anti-war movement helped Richard Nixon win the White House. But conservatives were dissatisfied with Nixon. Nixon adopted conservative language, but actually expanded the welfare state and improved relations with the Soviets and China. Nixon, who won by a thin margin, moved to the center, trying to solidify Republican support and win disaffected Democrats. Mostly interested in foreign policy and wanting to avoid fights with the Democratic Congress over domestic policy, Nixon actually accepted and expanded much of the Great Society and welfare state. Nixon established new federal regulatory agencies such as the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the National Transportation Safety Board, all of which limited entrepreneurial freedom. Nixon spent liberally on social services and environmental initiatives. He abolished the Office of Economic Opportunity, which had coordinated the war on poverty, but he also expanded food stamps and tied Social Security benefits to inflation. The Endangered Species and Clean Air Acts regulated businesses in order to limit pollution and protect animals threatened with extinction. Nixon's great surprise was his proposal for a family assistance plan to replace aid to families with dependent children. Under his plan, the federal government would guarantee a minimum income for all Americans. AFDC, known as welfare, gave aid, usually quite limited, to poor families who met a local eligibility requirement. Originally a New Deal program that helped mostly the white poor, welfare came to be associated with blacks, who by 1970 comprised half of all welfare recipients. AFDC roles expanded in the 1960s, partly because of relaxed federal eligibility standards. These relaxed standards stemmed from an increase in births to unmarried women, which produced a sharp rise in the number of poor female-headed households. Conservative politicians now attacked welfare recipients as people who wanted to live off honest taxpayers rather than work. But Nixon's plan for a guaranteed annual income, too radical for conservatives and not enough for liberals, did not pass Congress. Nixon's racial policy was ambiguous. He nominated for the Supreme Court conservative Southern jurists who favored segregation to win over the white South, but the Senate rejected them. The courts lost patience with Southern delays in enforcing civil rights law and finally forced Southern schools to desegregate. Briefly, Nixon also embraced affirmative action programs to raise minority employment. Nixon expanded Johnson's efforts to require federal contractors to hire minorities. But Nixon wanted the affirmative action program as a way to fight inflation by weakening the power of building trade unions, who he believed controlled the labor market and caused higher wages to unreasonable levels and increased construction costs. He hoped the plan would cause tensions between blacks and labor unions and that Republicans would benefit. Indeed, this is what happened. Trade unions of skilled construction workers with few black members strongly opposed Nixon's plan. Nixon hoped to win blue-collar workers over for the 1972 elections, and he quickly replaced his affirmative action plan with a program that did not require federal contractors to hire minorities. When Earl Warren retired as Chief Justice in 1969, Nixon replaced him with Warren Burger, an opponent of the Warren Court's judicial activism. Burger was expected to lead the Supreme Court in a conservative direction, but he surprised Nixon and others by initially expanding much of the Warren Court's jurisprudence. In 1971, the court approved plans to integrate Southern schools through busing, in which students were transported to other schools to make an integrated student body. Judges everywhere began to order busing, angering many white parents who wanted to keep their children in majority white neighborhood schools. Particularly bitter and violent protests broke out in Boston. In only a few years, the court reversed itself and abandoned efforts to wrest control of local schools or to bus students great distances to achieve integration. Rulings absolved suburban districts of the responsibility of enrolling non-white and often poor students from non-suburban neighborhoods. In 1973, the court ruled in a case out of Texas that public schools did not have to be equally funded, creating a disparity in school funding based on class and race. By the 1990s, northern public schools were more segregated than southern schools. Efforts to gain more job opportunities for minorities also sparked bitter legal battles and white resentments. Many whites came to see affirmative action programs as reverse discrimination that violated the 14th Amendment by giving non-whites special advantages over whites. As affirmative action spread from blacks to include women, Latinos, Asian, and Native Americans, conservatives demanded that the Supreme Court ban such programs. The Supreme Court refused but offered no consistent position. But the court proved more and more hostile to government affirmative action programs. In 1978, the court shot down a University of California admissions program that set aside a quota of places for non-white medical students. The majority rejected the ideas of quotas while ruling that race could be one factor among many in college admissions. The 1978 Regents of the University of California versus Bakke case is still the standard by which affirmative action programs are judged today. So that was our first question. We'll be back with you for the second section here in a minute.